History as it happens, October 12, 2023. Hamas.
United Nations laws have established Palestine as a free and independent state to be known as Israel.
The June 1967 Six-Day War fought between Israel and several neighboring Arab nations.
Inspired by Defense Minister Dayan, she took just over 50 hours to achieve her two.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt.
The Palestinians will have the right to participate in the determination of their own future in negotiations which will resolve the final status of the West Bank and Gaza.
The first intifada was sparked by the deaths of 4 Palestinians in December 1987.
They have to stop all this nonsense of the riots.
The protesters appeared determined to harass the army at every point.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time.
You oppose Hamas, and you've joined President Obama and me in denouncing Hamas and demanding that it release our captive soldier, Gilad Shalit.
More than 700 Israelis are now feared dead after unprecedented attacks by Hamas militants.
More than 1,000 civilians slaughtered. There's still so many families desperately waiting to hear the fate of their loved ones, not knowing if they're alive, or dead, or hostages.
Who is Hamas? What are the movement's origins, its aims and motivations? After the terrorist attack that killed more than 1,000 Israelis, the world's attention is focused on the group that triggered another war in the Middle East. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So when Hamas in the charter refers to Palestine as a waqf, they're basically saying, hey, wait a second, this is sanctified land. If the Palestinian leadership, the PLO leadership, starts talking about two-state solution or compromise with Israel, they're compromising God's property. They can't do that. It's not theirs to give away.
If you're looking for the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with all its violence, vengeance, dispossession, terrorism, and religious fanaticism, it's very easy to begin in 1948, the year of Israel's creation.
And there's one bold star on a brave new flag waving among the proud banners of free nations. But bounded on all sides by hostile Arab states, Israel
Palestinians call this the Nakba. As 5 Arab countries attacked the new Jewish state, about 700,000 Palestinians fled or were driven out. Some of their descendants live in Gaza to this day. Israel disputes the claim its fighters forced Palestinians from their homes. Or we can start in 1967, the Six-Day War. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Now, Israel left Gaza in 2005, but continues to occupy the West Bank, where Jewish settlement construction is arguably the most contentious of all the problems in the way of peace. But we're going to start in the late 1980s, late 1987 to be exact, and the first intifada, or uprising. According to historian William Cleveland, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir believed all the lands of biblical Israel should be incorporated into the Jewish state. As Prime Minister, he intensified the construction of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and committed the government to a policy of incorporating the territories into Israel. In addition to constructing new settlements, the Likud-dominated governments of the 1980s sought to prepare the way for the annexation of the territories by adopting measures designed to isolate and subjugate the Palestinian inhabitants. In this AP archive video, young Palestinians are seen throwing stones as Israeli military vehicles bulldoze through a makeshift barricade. In the early days of the uprising, Palestinians disavowed the use of knives and guns. They held mass demonstrations and took part in nonviolent forms of resistance, like boycotts and strikes, which Shamir responded to in this interview with the AP.
They have to stop all this nonsense of the riots, of throwing stones, of wounding people. It's useless.
As the uprising dragged on, it did grow more violent. The Intifada's leaders released a 14-point program. It called upon Israel to recognize an independent Palestinian state under PLO leadership. Out of this maelstrom of anger and protest emerged a new movement inspired by Islam and not interested in compromise with Israelis or the PLO, Hamas. In my conversation with George Washington University political scientist Nathan Brown, we'll try to trace the origins of Hamas in the late 1980s to the horrors we witnessed in Israel a few days ago, when Hamas soldiers massacred more than 1,000 Israeli civilians in a stunning surprise attack launched from Gaza. Entire families were murdered. A couple hundred Israelis at a music festival were gunned down like animals. The attack served no strategic military purpose, not that I can tell anyway. It won't bring Palestinians any closer to achieving statehood. Only a real peace process might accomplish that. Hamas might be trying to do the impossible, which is to undo history, to reverse the series of events and decisions since 1948 that have left Palestinians in such a terrible condition in Gaza and the West Bank, by destroying the State of Israel. Now, that is not a realistic aim, to say nothing of all the death and destruction that would come with it. Israeli retaliation is underway. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza have been flattened. At least an estimated 1,000 Palestinians have been killed, and you can read the latest developments in the war at WashingtonTimes.com. Nathan Brown is an expert on the Middle East and a co-editor of One State Reality: What is Israel-Palestine? Nathan Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us from Germany. So let's begin with your general thoughts, general observations on what happened, what's been happening since Saturday, the Hamas onslaught into Israel. Stunning, terrifying, but in my view, not unexpected. I mean, there have been several outbreaks of violence between Israel and Gaza over the past 15 years or so.
Yeah, well, I think what happened was, in a sense, very, very surprising, very shocking. Not that there was fighting between Israel on the one hand and Hamas on the other. As you see, that's happened many times before. And that there was some kind of outburst. In a sense, people were expecting them. The situation there was explosive. There was rising tension with Hamas. There was rising tension in Jerusalem. There was increasing alienation by Palestinians in the West Bank. You know, I was actually there for a while this summer, and especially younger Palestinians I spoke to were just saying, somebody's got to do something. So some kind of explosion or some kind of round of violence wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise was just the extent to which Hamas attempted really to breach the border at every single point, and their incredible tactical success in doing so, in catching Israelis off guard, taking over Israeli settlements, taking over Israeli police stations, and killing large numbers of people. That was not expected.
Yeah, I think everyone's astonished that Gaza, where Israel has a blockade, it's not a large geographic space. Israel basically had it sealed off, supposedly, is watching it, 24/7 surveillance to completely miss this. But one criticism, before we start getting to some of the history here, one criticism of the Israeli government was, or is, it had too many of its forces in the West Bank because of all the violence that's been going on there with the settlers, etc., and it took its eye off of Gaza.
I'm not an operational expert, so I don't know what would have happened had there been more people on hand. But what I would say is that the Israelis thought they had essentially a stable situation of deterrence. Hamas knew that if it initiated anything, Gaza would be hit hard. And they also had some reason to think that Israel was sort of letting things up on work permits and that sort of thing. You know, Israel says it will never negotiate with terrorist organizations. But the fact is they had negotiated indirectly through Egypt a whole series of arrangements which both sides were unhappy with, but essentially were explicit understandings. And so Israel had reason to believe that those understandings might be punctuated by another round of fighting like in the past, but nothing on the scale of what happened. So I'm not going to say the Israelis shouldn't have been surprised, because I was very surprised.
Well, on that note, here is an op-ed from Haaretz written by Gidi Weitz. Hamas as partner. He says, effectively, Netanyahu's entire worldview collapsed over the course of a single day. He was convinced that he could make deals with corrupt Arab tyrants while ignoring the cornerstone of the Arab-Jewish conflict, the Palestinians. He says his life's work was to turn the ship of state from the course steered by his predecessors and make the two-state solution impossible. En route to this goal, he found a partner in Hamas. So how did that partnership, I was going to get to this later, but since you brought it up, we'll tackle it now. What was the nature of this, informal partnership that Netanyahu had carved out with Hamas?
The relationship between the Israeli leadership and Hamas was not a meeting of minds, and it was not anything that was going to be permanent or stable long term. But it wasn't just Netanyahu. You can go back essentially to 2007 when Hamas got control of the Gaza Strip, uncontested control of the Gaza Strip. And there were a series of agreements explicitly negotiated, essentially based on the idea that Gaza can wait. And this wasn't just Netanyahu, and this wasn't just Israel. The American position was exactly the same. In one previous round of fighting in Gaza, this was in 2008, late 2008, just as the Obama administration was preparing to come in, the Obama administration came in and said essentially, okay, we've just had this horrible round of fighting in Gaza, and therefore we've got to increase our assistance to the government in Ramallah, in the West Bank. It was essentially Gaza, no fighting there, nothing to worry about. Let's kick this can down the road. That was Obama. That was Trump. That was Biden. That was the Israeli governments before Netanyahu. What Netanyahu and the Biden administration seem to have been doing over the past year or so was trying to reach, and then this may go back to the Trump administration as well, with the talk of the Abraham Accords, try to reach a series of bilateral understandings between Israel and other Arab states so that Gaza would become irrelevant, not just in the short term, but perhaps in the medium and long term. So that's the element that this last round of fighting disrupts, maybe permanently, maybe not, but it certainly disrupts it.
Yeah, and you referenced the violence in 2008. Israel launched a 22-day military offensive in Gaza after rockets were fired at the southern Israeli town of Sderot. 1,400 Palestinians, 13 Israelis were killed before a ceasefire was agreed upon. So, Hamas, who is this group? What is their ideology? What is their aims? What's day-to-day life like under Hamas rule in Gaza? So let's go back to the late 1980s, December 9th, 1987. There was an accident. Thousands of Palestinians gathered to protest after a road accident involving an Israeli military vehicle that killed 4 Palestinians and injured several others. I'm reading here from William Cleveland's book, A History of the Modern Middle East, a chapter about the First Intifada. There was a lot of anger on the part of especially younger Palestinians, right, in the occupied territories. This road accident was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. So there were a lot of protests. There was something called the United National Leadership. Take it from there, Nathan.
Okay, sure. So the situation then in the late 80s was actually a little bit similar to the situation right now. There was no real viable diplomatic process between Israelis and Palestinians. Palestinians were getting hopeless. Nobody's standing up for us, and we're being ignored, essentially, on the world stage. So it was in that context that Hamas, which had already been sort of building itself in the mid to early 80s, really comes out and presents itself to Palestinians of the world. Hamas is an acronym. It stands for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which is the movement of Islamic resistance. And the initials in Arabic are pronounced Hamas. So it's a movement, right? It's not a political party. It's supposed to be something very, very broad, not just about terrorism, not just about one thing, not just about another. It's about social service provision. It's about resistance, and it's about political organizing and religion and so on. It's Islamic, right? So the main Palestinian movements up till that point had been nationalist and leftist, and here are people saying, no, we need an Islamic movement. And then it's a resistance movement, as the resistance is to Israel. So it forms out of, I would say, religious political activists, Palestinians, some of them in the diaspora, places like Kuwait and Jordan, some of them in the West Bank, some of them in Israeli prisons, some of them in Gaza. And they formed this organization in the mid-'80s saying, essentially, we're going to be the Islamic alternative to the mainstream Palestinian nationalist organizations. And the Intifada was the spark that said, essentially, okay, now's the time to come out of the woodwork and present ourselves and start undertaking actual operations in order to show that anything that the nationalists and the leftists can do among Palestinians, we can do better.
It's amazing when you read the history here. If you copy and paste some of this text into a newspaper today, you wouldn't know the difference. The Likud governments in Israel during this time, mid-'80s to the early 90s, The Israeli state stepped up its practice of confiscating plots of Arab land. The Israeli security services deported an increasing number of suspected political activists. Administrative detention, a practice that permitted Palestinians to be arrested without a warrant and held for up to 6 months without being charged, was employed with greater frequency. The occupation intruded on the daily lives of Palestinians in countless ways. They were required to carry ID cards, pay special taxes. They had to overcome a maze of bureaucratic obstacles and security checks to obtain the most basic licenses and business permits, etc., etc. So out of this oppression comes the first intifada. And I mentioned something called the United National Leadership, composed of a small group of individuals representing the major local factions of the PLO. But as the intifada proceeds, this other group, this other movement, Hamas, emerges. It was related to the Muslim Brotherhood as well, right? So who were the early leaders and members of this movement?
So the Muslim Brotherhood was an organization that started in Egypt in the late 20s and the 1930s, and then different movements in Jordan, Kuwait, and Syria kind of modeled themselves after, saying we can build our own Muslim Brotherhood. Some Palestinians were doing the same thing in the late 30s, early 1940s, mid-1940s. The Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood was just getting underway. At the time, Palestine, the single place, Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, all of it was a British mandatory territory, but that mandate was coming to an end. And it ended in warfare, which resulted in the creation of the State of Israel. The Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood was being created at that time. And essentially, with the Arab defeat and the creation of the State of Israel, essentially it went into hibernation. And a lot of its old generation leaders said, the problem was we weren't religious enough. As soon as Palestinians really start getting religious, start going to the mosque, fasting during Ramadan, praying all the time, then we'll be able to liberate Palestine. And younger Palestinians looked at that and saying, okay, you sit on your couch and, you read the Quran, we're going to go out and do something. A younger generation of Islamists, Palestinian Islamists, essentially where I think they got tired of being taunted by the leftists and by the nationalists and saying, we can have an Islamic resistance movement just like your leftist ones. And so that's when they start talking in the 1980s. So it's a younger generation of Islamists who are looking at things like the reemergence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They're looking at the Iranian Revolution saying, wait a second, religion can be a revolutionary force. It doesn't just have to be a stay-at-home force. And they're trying to act on that kind of inspiration to lead the Palestinian movement in a much more religious direction.
Yeah, there's a lot going on during this period of time globally or across the Middle East, right? The Iranian Revolution, Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the foundation of Hezbollah, where religious fervor is driving the formation of these movements. And as you say, the earliest leaders or members of Hamas were of a younger generation. So I was reading the Charter, which dates to 1988, the Hamas Covenant. It's inescapable that Islam is at the heart of it. Just like Islam, in my view, was at the heart of Al-Qaeda, Sunni Islam is at the heart of Hamas ideology. What is and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, what is a Waqf? W-A-Q-F. How does that term make it impossible for Hamas to accept any negotiation for, say, a two-state solution?
Okay. What a Waqf is easy to explain. Its relevance is a little bit harder. And the Charter is something I want to say something about because it's a little bit of an ambiguous document. Not its content, which is crystal clear, but exactly the status of the document. So first, what is a Waqf? A Waqf is essentially a foundation, a charitable foundation, or an endowment. You endow it. Usually a piece of property, it can sometimes be other things. And you say, I'm going to give this to a charitable purpose. I'm going to give this piece of this farm. And rent the farmer pays will go to support this hospital, this mosque, and so on. Well, when you make a Waqf in Islamic law, essentially what happens is that property that you're giving to charitable purposes becomes God's property. You're giving it to God, and you can't ungive it. So once it's given, it's permanent. It is supposed to stay there for all time and be used for charitable purposes. So when Hamas in the Charter refers to Palestine as a Waqf, they're basically saying, hey, wait a second, this is sanctified land. It's not anybody's to give away. If the Palestinian leadership, the PLO leadership starts talking about two-state solution or compromise with Israel, they're compromising God's property. They can't do that. It's not theirs to give away. So it makes essentially a negotiated understanding with Israel impossible. It makes it impossible on religious grounds. But now let me step back and say something about the charter. So Hamas is arising in the 1980s. The Intifada breaks out late 1987, 1988, and Hamas kind of rushes forward. They produce this document right away. Hamas is a movement of doers. There are plenty of Palestinian intellectuals, but they tend to go in different directions. Hamas is not a movement of ideologues. It's a movement of people who are very religious. They take their religion very, very seriously. But 20-page documents, charters, that's not what they do. So it's interesting when you talk to people from Hamas, when you read their stuff, they will talk about their positions. They will talk about their position on Israel. They will say, we won't accept Israel. We might accept this. We might accept that. We won't accept this. They very rarely go back to the charter itself. So the charter itself, it's not clear that it's really a good indication of where Hamas is. And the other thing that's important to know about the organization is that, it's growing very, very quickly. It's also trying to do all different kinds of things. And so the movement is just a lot more diverse than it used to be. There are some people who are, technocrats. There are ministry bureaucrats. There are some people who are mosque preachers. There are some people who are fighters and so on. They have mechanisms for making decisions. It's clear. But you talk to each one of these and you get a very different image of what the organization and what it's about. So that's why I don't place too much weight on the charter itself. It means something for some people in the organization and others don't even know what it says.
I'll just share, for what it's worth, Article 13 of the Charter from 1988 here. There's no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. The Palestinian people know better than to consent to having their future, rights, and fate toyed with. And then it quotes the Hadith after that before it moves on to article number 14. So Israel crushes the first Intifada, which winds down in the early 1990s. How do the Israeli governments that had been under Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir until 1992, so how do the Israeli governments, as the 1990s unfold, respond to this new movement?
Well, when they see Hamas emerging, now this goes back to the 1980s, their first thought is, hey, that's great. There's a challenge to Fatah, there's a challenge to PLO, there's a challenge to all these leftists and nationalists. And the Islamists we know are the ones who like to form religion discussion sessions and this sort of thing. So this is great. So at first they say, by all means, go ahead.
Yeah, they're going to go to the mosques and not attack us. This is not a security threat, essentially, right?
Yes. And that changes basically in 1987, 1988. So they come down hard on the organization. They don't necessarily see it as more of a threat than the other Palestinian movements. But by the early 1990s, and especially not just Shamir, but his successor, when his successor from the more left-leaning Labor Party comes in, Yitzhak Rabin, they begin to say, hey, we've got to smash this as a movement before it gets any bigger. And so they deport a lot of the Hamas leadership or people that they associate with Hamas. They just put them on helicopters and dump them over the border in Lebanon in the middle of winter. So that's how they try to deal with it. The problem for Israel has always been Fatah is a different kind of movement. It's organized around kind of prominent individuals with individual followings and so on. And Hamas is a strong organization. You take away some people and other people just fill their place. So they found that what they could do would be to shut down specific operations, specific charities, even assassinate leaders. But the movement itself just seemed to have staying power. It seemed to have some grassroots strength that decapitating the movement wouldn't help them with.
Yeah, because the PLO was looked at as outsiders. I mean, Arafat wasn't even in Palestine during these years.
Exactly. The PLO leadership on the outside is saying, wait a second, if things like this United National leadership in the West Bank and Gaza gets too strong, they'll start negotiating with the Israelis and we'll be cut out. Hamas isn't like that. Hamas is really grounded primarily in the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah. So here's a question that is relevant today as well. What, if any, support did Hamas receive from Arab states or Iran during this period of time?
In this early period, they got some support. It's not quite clear how much from religious people that tended to be in the Gulf, and also from wealthy Palestinian communities in the Gulf. Large expatriate Palestinian communities in places like Kuwait, and at least until 1990. And those who are more religious tended to look at Hamas as a worthy cause. But I would say Hamas is primarily rooted in the West Bank and Gaza. When the movement gets bigger, when it tries to essentially form a government and so on, it needs foreign diplomatic support. But at this early period, their ties with Iran are very, very distant. And even their ties with regional governments tend to be fairly weak.
Yeah, that question today of whether Iran planned or ordered the attack from Gaza, I'm not buying that yet. I don't see convincing evidence. What happens here is people project their own obsessions onto an international incident, and that's a way of ignoring the local origins of what's going on. So early 90s, we get the Oslo Accords. Arafat returns to Palestine as a virtual outsider, as I mentioned. And he wants to suppress rival groups. That includes Hamas, which by this time has support in the West Bank as well. You got into this a little bit, but what were the reasons for the rivalry between the PLO and Hamas? And what role did Hamas play in the unraveling of the Oslo Accords, which is a long process? It plays out over the rest of the 1990s and into the 2000s, and then Oslo is virtually dead.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time.
Well, so the Oslo Accords were a real shock to Palestinians. I mean, for some it was a positive shock. For others, it was a negative shock. And they don't know quite what to do. And Hamas dithers a little bit. And Arafat's first message to them was saying, okay, you don't like them? Join us, run for elections. We're going to have a parliament. We're going to have presidential elections. Just join us. And Hamas hesitates. Says, well, maybe we should run. Maybe we should. Maybe we should. Maybe we shouldn't. In the end, they decide, wait a second, if we run, we'll get caught up. We'll be sucked into this peace process that we don't really believe in. So we will stay out of elections. And what that meant was, during the period in which there was a real peace process in the 1990s, the Oslo process, Hamas was on the outside. What they basically said was, we're not going to fight other Palestinians. We're not going to fight Yasser Arafat. We're not going to fight the Palestinian Authority that's being built, but we won't stop resistance against Israel. And at this point, resistance begins to morph into attacks not just on Israeli military targets, but on Israeli civilians, suicide bombings, and so on. The Palestinian Authority comes under tremendous pressure from Israel, from the United States, saying, you've got to crack down on these people. You've got to stop it. And so they do, sometimes half-heartedly. And Hamas basically kept on saying, no matter what happens, we're not going to strike back. That earned them a lot of credibility, actually, among Palestinians, because they were saying, hold on a second, the Palestinian Authority is doing what the Americans, what the Israelis tell them, and they're hitting Hamas, and Hamas is not hitting the Palestinian Authority back. These people are real Palestinian nationalists. And so their popularity increased. And as the peace process floundered, and as Palestinians began to see this isn't leading to a Palestinian state as we recognize it. It seems to be just a corrupt group of politicians who are lining their own pockets rather than leading us anywhere. Hamas's popularity began to increase. So it really became the opposition. And even people who weren't particularly religious and so on began to say, okay, we don't like Hamas's religious ideas, but at least they're clearly principled people.
What about anti-Semitism? I want to ask you about that when I was talking about Hamas's origins and its founding ideology, its religious fervor. Some people will say, listen, this is plain and simple hatred of Jews.
There certainly is hatred of Jews if you look in the Charter, traces of real traditional anti-Semitism. For Hamas, what I would say is generally this is a religious conflict of Muslims against Jews. And Palestinians in normal conversation, and actually even some Israelis, will sometimes go back and forth between Israelis and Jews, the national category and the religious category. If you were to listen to Hamas people talk about themselves, you'd certainly hear some things that would be classic anti-Semitism, and certainly you wouldn't hear very many flattering things about Jews. To what extent anti-Semitism actually motivates this movement, I think really varies. For some of them, especially probably, I would say the oldest generation, probably some of the more insular ones, this is a religious struggle against Jews, and Judaism is a bad religion. I think for younger ones, more practical ones, this is primarily a national struggle. And it's a struggle against Israel. It's a struggle against Israelis. It's a struggle against Israeli Jews. Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship are not a target for them. Hatred of Jews is not a motivating force for them. It's more of a byproduct.
Yeah, it's hard to single out any one of these strands or factors, right? Because they all interact with each other. It's not that Arabs and Jews are fighting over the finer points of theology, but religion is fundamental to this conflict. It informs each side's view of who controls the land. But there's also politics or facts on the ground, as Netanyahu likes to say. We're dealing with a military occupation that's been going on since 1967. That's a huge factor as well. That wasn't really so much a question there. I'm just trying to make sense of how all of these ideas and issues overlap, right? Because I do think understanding motivations is critical.
But one thing about the current moment that is notable, in my mind, actually really distressing, is the extent to which each side is basically unable to understand that the other side is human. You saw that with what Hamas did. It trampled down the border fences. It took over these communities. That's maybe standard guerrilla military operation, but then it started slaughtering civilians. And I'm not going to try and equate one side with the other or perform any sort of moral balance sheets here.
Yeah, of course.
But some of what you're hearing from Israeli leaders are essentially, well, if civilian Palestinians get hurt, that's Hamas's fault. In the past, we tried to target individual Hamas leaders. Now we're just going to target whatever building they're in. And if civilians die, that's Hamas's fault. And so you're really seeing at the current moment this dehumanization where neither side really treats the other as human or valid or deserving of anything.
So let me ask, how much popular support does Hamas have in Gaza today? I don't know, public opinion polling, it's hard to tell, right? Because this goes to the issue of collective punishment.
So yeah, there is lots of public opinion polling. And here's the interesting thing. Generally, with the public opinion polling, shows that Hamas is more popular in the West Bank than it is in Gaza, where it rules. And Fatah is more popular in Gaza rather than in the West Bank, where it rules. So it's more of a kind of there's got to be something better in town among Palestinian population. What I would say generally is this. Hamas has enthusiastic support from probably something like 20-25% of Palestinian society. And of the rest, probably 20-25% hate their guts. And the middle are people who see them as perhaps a little bit extreme, too religious, causing problems and that sort of thing. But that's a middle that can sometimes be persuaded. And a couple of things kind of persuade them. One is, as I say, kind of the perceived corruption of the mainstream nationalist leadership. And the other is the bankruptcy of the mainstream national leadership. They have no peace process. They have no strategy, nothing to offer. So at times when that happens, and that includes the present, if you take a look at things like student union elections at Palestinian universities or that sort of thing, or public opinion polls, Hamas's stock tends to go up. And also when Hamas does something, it's like, yeah, finally somebody is doing something. Who cares what it is? At least it's something. Essentially what has happened is as much revulsion as the Hamas slaughter of civilians has caused, Palestinians woke up this past weekend and thought somebody's finally doing something. We'll ask questions about what it was and where it leads later, but somebody's finally acting. So all power to them. So the immediate effect, the immediate short-term effect will be to make Hamas's popularity skyrocket. When the repercussions become clear, that may change.
You all know these traumas never go away. There's still so many families desperately waiting to hear the fate of their loved ones, not knowing if they're alive or dead or hostages. Infants in their mother's arms, grandparents in wheelchairs, Holocaust survivors abducted and held hostage. Hostages whom Hamas has now threatened to execute in violation of every code of human morality. It's abhorrent. The brutality of Hamas, these bloodthirstiness brings to mind the worst rampages of ISIS. This is terrorism. But sadly, for the Jewish people, it's not new.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to stay in the Middle East as the new war rages on. We'll be joined by Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft as we discuss the geopolitical implications of what's happening there. As you know, Israel was moving closer to a normalization with Saudi Arabia. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.